So good afternoon and welcome everyone to our weekly Dial Global virtual workshop. Today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome the very lovely Amy Broadbent. Amy is the HR business partner at the British Business Bank, and she's going to be talking to us all today about the inclusion journey thus far with the British Business Bank, and also some of the key observations that she has made, what's worked, what hasn't along that journey. As I'm sure you can all agree, when it comes to diversity, inclusion and belonging, everyone is on a journey, and each of us are often at different phases of that journey. So I think it's really important for us all to remember, whether you are literally right at the beginning of that journey and you're starting to set out the stall for your employee resource groups, or whether you are right the way through having set up executive sponsors and starting to now champion certain groups. Don't worry, there is something for everyone, and we're delighted to have Amy here to share with us all today. Now, if you've got any questions at all, there are 2 live chat functions. The team are keeping an eye on those, so we will get round to answering your questions at relevant points throughout the presentation that Amy will do. Otherwise, we will have a question and answer session at the end. So please do feel free to chip in and ask questions. Please don't be worried. None of us are judging here at all. This is a safe environment. So ask whatever or comment as you feel necessary. Without further ado, welcome Amy, and thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you. So thanks for having me here today. My name's Amy Broadbent. I'm a HR business partner at British Business Bank. I've worked at the bank since 2016. Before that, I worked in HR in construction, which has meant that I've had quite a varied career so far in terms of organisations that I've worked for. So in terms of British Business Bank, I lead on diversity and inclusion. And today I'm going to talk a bit about British Business Bank, our diversity and inclusion journey so far, but also our ambition the way, and we recognise that we're still learning as we go along. So who is British Business Bank? A lot of people actually ask me, they say that they've actually never heard of British Business Bank, but we've actually been going since 2014, but we're actually a government owned, we're classed as an arm's length organisation, but we're 100% owned by the government, and our mission is to drive economic growth by making finance markets work better for smaller business. So in recent months you might have heard about the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, or bounce back loans, and we're the people behind those. We work with more than 130 delivery partners to deliver funding programs that address existing gaps in the market. And our programs are designed to help businesses at 3 stages: start up, scale up, so for those businesses with high growth potential, and then stay ahead, so viable companies that are seeking to stay ahead in their markets. But the reason that I'm telling you this, all this, is kind of just to make you aware that our colleagues are really bought in and engaged with the mission of the organisation, and that's really clear when we talk and get feedback on engagement in the organisation. So how did we start our diversity inclusion journey, which is why we're all here today to listen to. As I said, we were set up in 2014, and we've grown massively in that time, and we can continue to keep growing. So kind of to put some perspective on it, as I said, I've been with the bank since 2016, but when I joined the bank we were 75 people, and to date we are just under 400 people, so it's a massive amount of growth in that time. We are split between 2 locations, predominantly Sheffield and London, and I say that with a slight caveat because we're all working from home at the moment, so we're obviously in a lot more locations at the moment. But we also have a team that are based across the UK as well, and the backgrounds of colleagues are a real mix. We have a mixture of ex-civil servants that have come from public sector backgrounds, but we also have financial service backgrounds and other private sector organisations. And like lots of organisations, we've had high engagement and early conversations around inclusion. And we've also had bits of activities around significant events in the diary. So, for example, we've done events around International Women's Day and some religious festivals. But I think it's fair to say that we haven't had anything that's created alignment with an overall strategy or our culture or any sort of long-term approach. And we're also quite aware that we've had little use of our data to show the impact of our policies and procedures in the organisation. So work started last August to put in place a roadmap to start on the journey, but also to start moving the organisation on its journey. So this is actually an overview of the roadmap that we're working towards. So as I mentioned previously, we've been working on it for a while now, but I think it's definitely fair to say that the recent events and the Black Lives Matter movement has been a catalyst in our organisation to get more traction and to grow the voice on inclusion in our organisation. And our ambition is to get the organisation to a place where we have inclusion activities ingrained into the fabric of British Business Bank, which we recognise will take a while, but that's our ambition. And that the activities are, and the awareness is cohesive and underpinned by a broader diversity and inclusion strategy. Because we know we have high engagement and that our colleagues are all interested in this space, but we want to match this by high impact from our activities and the awareness that we have in the organisation. And it's definitely evolving in this space as we go on the journey, because we are so early on in on the journey. But also to say, kind of just with that whole piece in mind, that we want to be careful and measured in what we do with our activities, because the whole principle that's underpinning it is that we want to have a solid foundation that we consistently build on each year. So with that in mind, we are thinking about internal activities only. We're not thinking about external activities because we really want to have that solid foundation before we move on to anything else. So the roadmap. So the roadmap's split into three phases. So there's the foundation phase, which was last year. There's the establish and evolve the approach, which is what we're concentrating on this year. And then there's engage, embed and create impact, which is next year onwards. So if we could move on to the next slide, please.
Absolutely. Amy, I wonder whether it would be possible, because we had a number of people write in who weren't able to make today's session, were very keen on learning more about some of the decision-making process that you went through when exploring the foundation stage. And I think it's a perfect time to ask this question. This is a great segue. We also had a number of organizations, in particular SMEs, which is really, really interesting, who are asking what they can do around diversity, inclusion and belonging. Because whilst, and I know that you obviously are aware of what we do at DIAL, we have a number of big global organizations who I think the presumption is naturally they're going to be having these big diversity and inclusion and belonging strategies. But perhaps that for smaller organizations, it's harder sometimes for them because they may have less resources. You know, how would they be able to look at this if they aren't quite as big? Now, we obviously talk them through various different aspects and that they can still do things that larger organizations are. But I wondered whether you had seen or had any advice or observations that you could share with other organisations that, like the British Business Bank, have gone from, you know, still a sizable figure at the 75 mark, you know, but still sit within that SME space or in a high growth mode, as you have, having obviously, you know, quadrupled your staff count over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think especially for us, it's very, lots of people in the organisation, which is great, are very enthusiastic about this subject. And when you talk to them, they have lots of ideas around what they want to do and kind of things that we could do in the future. And we're really aware of how we start this journey, but also do what we can do right and well, as opposed to doing lots of things and kind of not getting them 100% right. So we're very aware of just taking it step by step, as opposed to just jumping into kind of, you know, on the roadmap kind of phase 3 where we've got all these things in place. So yeah, we're trying to be very measured and targeted about what we do.
That's really helpful. So basically what you've done is done the research, looked at organizations, looked at the policies and procedures that you have already in place, and then looked at the key areas that you can then start to expand on before actually you know, investing and growing those specific areas.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you move on to the next slide, then I can talk a little bit through around kind of what we did to start pulling everything together. I think that perhaps might help the answer to the question. So yeah, so this is how I started to pull everything together, and kind of what I found in the organization is there's a lot of activities that go on, but it's kind of it's all disjointed, and kind of we don't know what's happening in all the different areas. So my focus on this was to have something that I can see what our foundation is, so that I know where we're going. Because kind of I don't know what to build. If I don't know what we've got in place, I don't know what I'm building on. So kind of I started to pull it. I could see that it started to pull into 4 main areas to start building on. And these are the areas that are on the slide at the moment. So it started off kind of with what memberships we have, what accreditations we have, and we have various different ones. But for example, we're, I don't know, a disability committed employer, or we're signed up to the Armed Forces Covenant. So it was just understanding what actually we have in place before we could start thinking about what else we might want to add to that in the future. And then we also, well, I also looked at what recruitment processes we have in place. So kind of thinking about how we actually attract people to the organisation, and how do we advertise, what job boards do we use. So for example, we advertise on some forces job boards, we advertise on some LGBT plus job boards, but also what job fairs are we going to? We are represented in a few different job fairs around things like women in finance, or and it's also, so it was pulling together what are we actually doing, and what do we want to do in that space. So it's more cohesive, and it's not a kind of scattergun approach. The other thing that I looked at was what kind of training and events are going on in the organisation. So as I mentioned before, we had some events around different religious festivals, and also some other dates, so for example Pride or International Women's Day. But also we were doing, or we still do some training around personal impact for women as well. So it was just pulling together what kind of aspects of training we are doing. Then lastly, it was around looking at what we are doing for our reporting. So what's our kind of reporting and data activities? So we're actually signed up to the Women in Finance Charter, which I'm not sure if people have heard of, but if you haven't, then it's an initiative between HM Treasury and organisations sign up to say that together we'll work on building a more balanced and fair financial service industry. So we have a set of targets and a commitment against those each year. So we report against them each year. But in addition to that, we also report on diversity on our annual report. Each year we have a set our ambitions in the report, but we also report on our gender pay as well. And then also in terms of reporting, it was looking at what's our monthly diversity statistics and data, and kind of what do we use that for? Is it fit for purpose? What are the limitations of what we can actually get from our systems? What data would we like to see in the future? So it was pulling all of those things together to kind of just say, this is where we are, right, line in the sand, this is where we need to move on from. So if we can just go to the next slide, please. So yeah, so once we pulled all that together, we've moved into the second phase of the roadmap, which is this year. So we want to establish and evolve the approach to inclusion in the organisation. So that's actually around starting to create our diversity and inclusion strategy. And the first place that we've gone to start with that is to get sponsorship from our, we call it EXCO, but the senior levels of the management. To be honest, we already have quite good engagement with that group of people, but it was really important to have a visible sponsor at the top of the organisation who would lead on that. Then we also looked at internal communications, and our aim really is for activity and awareness to grow organically through colleagues in networks and activities. But what we thought was important is to set up an intranet. We have an intranet within the organisation, but to set up our own intranet presence on the internal intranet. Too many intranets there. But I think it's fair to say it's a work in progress, but it's very reflective of where we are as an organisation. But it was very important to have that presence there so that we can keep colleagues updated through the page, but there's also somewhere for colleagues to find out what's our ambitions, what we're working on. So yes, that's there. But we've also just set up an employee resource group. It's one overall group because of the size of our organisation. And for us to be very early on in the journey, we felt that it was better to have one group and get that right than the multiple groups. And what we've done is we've got different levels of involvement and participation. So you could be part of the core group, and that would mean that you have a time commitment to be part of the core group. But if you don't and can't have that time commitment, then we also have allies of the group who are involved with the conversations in the organisation. We are very welcome to come along and get involved in activities, but they don't have to have the time commitment to the core group. The other thing that we're doing is that we are reviewing all our existing HR policies and procedures to ensure that they're fit for purpose both now, but then also to tie in with our aspirations for the future as well. And we thought the reason why we're doing this is that it's important to know if there's any gaps or things that we should be doing better, and then also if there are any gaps, then how do we put a plan together to be doing those things better. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So these are actually the things that we've achieved so far. So we've actually created a diversity and inclusion mission statement, and it's actually close to being rolled out to the organisation. And this was actually put together with help from colleagues within the organisation. We went out and asked for feedback from them, and they helped put it together. But it actually draws inspiration from our organisational values, from our branding, and actually our employee value proposition. It was actually really good timing because we've just been updating it all, and inclusion plays a key part in those activities. So actually it felt like a right time with the work going on in those spaces to build a mission statement that can underpin this journey and help us along. We're also going to be participating in Inclusion Week this year, and we've got some activities to support in the week, and our EXCO sponsor is going to be having an event in that week as well, which will be great. We've launched our employee resource group, and our first meeting will be in the next few weeks, which I'm really excited about. And then as I said before, our work continues reviewing all our policies, our HR policies and procedures, and the work's been driven by the employee life cycle, but also making sure that we step back and review to see if there's anything else we can do. But also what I would say is access to, as I said before, what access we have to data, and really so we can really review if we are where we think we are, but also if we can prove that we are where we think we are by using the data to help. So for example, for the last couple of months, we've been collating data around the diversity of our recruitment process, because we want to show if we have any bias in the process, and we're just in the process of collecting that data and seeing if we can see any patterns in it. which should be interesting. So I think it's safe to say that we're finally getting to a place where we know what our foundation is and what we need to work on, and that we can start pulling together a more kind of broader, cohesive, overarching strategy to go with it. If we could move on to the next slide, please. And then these are our ambitions for phase 3 and beyond, I would say, to be honest. There's lots of things that we know we can do in this space, but kind of what, as I said before, we're very aware of having that solid foundation and really doing what we want, the activities that we want to do, really doing them well, as opposed to doing lots of activities not so well or a bit. So because we're spreading ourselves too thin, I guess is what I'm saying. So these are some of the activities that we've identified that we want to do, and there's probably a lot more that we could do, but it's kind of these are key activities that we'd like to get involved in future years. Targeted activities around groups to improve awareness and representation in the organisation, inclusive leadership training. We'd also like to get involved with some outreach programs, which we did do previously under our CSR program, but actually it wasn't the right time to continue with it, but it's our ambition to pick it up again in the future. But also in terms of colleague participation, we want to start at some point to move towards fostering a sense of belonging within the organisation, but we appreciate that we can't do that until our foundation's in place, definitely. And we're also well aware that we're early on in the journey and that it's an ambition. The ambition should be there, but it'll take time to get there. We also would hope that we had at that point an embedded network of ambassadors, champions, influencers within the organisation. And then also employee engagement. So solid data that we can set around employee engagement, any points of pressure that we have in our process, and then also perhaps even some sort of external benchmarking of the organisation. But kind of above all, what I would say is that we want colleagues to be aware, engaged, participate in our conversations or the conversation, but feel that British Business Bank has a safe space to contribute and that diversity runs through more broadly all our conversations in the organisation. And then if we could move on to the next slide, please. So we recognise that we're most definitely still learning whilst we're on this journey, but kind of things that we've learned so far. And some of these I'll appreciate are obvious, but I thought they were good things to just call out whilst I was reflecting on what we've learned so far. So that change takes time, definitely, but small steps contribute to bigger impact. But that also we're treading a path of how to make colleagues feel comfortable that this isn't a HR-led initiative and that we encourage them to contribute and participate to this conversation. The other thing that I would say is to be aware of time commitment for people. So I probably could spend all day talking about inclusion with people, but obviously they have other day-to-day workload that they need to be working on. So I'm just mindful of what we ask for people and what's reasonable in addition to what they actually do. And then with this in mind, I would say build on your allies and your network, because you're looking for people to champion and drive forward the conversations and activities around the organisation, but also encourage people to participate in the conversation as well. So yes, I think I'm open for any questions now if we have any questions come in.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Amy. That was brilliant. And we've had a whole host of questions, actually. So I'm going to rattle through some of these, which, and to be fair, I think a number of people who've written in, I actually think that you probably have covered a number of their questions. So I'm going to just start with some of the ones that we have for those who are here at the moment. First of all, one which is around the key pieces on measurement. You mentioned the gender pay gap. This individual wondered whether you were tracking the ethnicity pay gap yet, and also how you managed to improve the gender pay gap specifically, because their goal is also eventually to achieve complete gender parity and close that gap completely. So any advice on how you actually did that would be wonderful.
So yes. So in terms of the ethnicity pay gap, this is something that, yes, we don't report on at the moment. It's something that, I'll be honest, the conversation is going on within the organisation. So yeah, it is something that's ongoing. In terms of the gender pay gap, we have in place, we talk a lot about internal mobility and how that will help. We also have the Women in Finance Charter, which helps because we have, our target for that is 50-50 parity, and we have a deadline on that. And then also in terms of our recruitment processes, we have diverse shortlists, but then also we are now starting to use the data to make sure about any bias in the process. So there's a few things that we work on to try and help with that the gender pay gap. I'll be honest though, our figures are quite good, to be honest. So.
And that's really great to hear. And a number of the questions that we have, and also have for those writing in, they are trying to get to where you are and to ultimately close that. And you know, we have said, you know, much as you have said, is actually there's no one silver bullet. You know, it needs to come from the talent angle in terms of diverse shortlists. And also from looking at the other objectives internally. If we can spend a little bit of time on the talent piece, that would be brilliant. So we've had a couple of talent related questions around diverse shortlists. Obviously my background is exec search, so I know a little bit about this, but the questions were, how have you gone about approaching the diverse shortlists internally? Do you have specific figures, i.e. whether you're looking at purely female shortlists or purely ethnic minority shortlists, or whether you're looking at a percentage of that talent being from certain backgrounds?
It's not, I would say it's not so much around kind of having a percentage, or even, to be honest, having a short list of all women, for example. It's not so much around that. I mean, if I'm completely honest, we're restricted in terms of internal mobility. We are restricted into, because we're 400 people, so it is slightly difficult and challenging. But yeah, it's just around kind of making sure that we've done everything we can to make sure that shortlist is as diverse as possible.
Excellent. I think, and you know, I guess my take, you know, depends on, I suppose, the size of the organisation, but also how much that organisation specifically wants to look at that diversity of mindset, because it isn't all about those visible diversities. That said, there have been instances where we have, as an organisation, looked specifically at a purely female shortlist. And you know, it's interesting, I'd love to know your thoughts on this, because if I ever say that, I'll get one of two answers most of the time. Either A, I can't believe you're doing that, because that is you know, positive discrimination, or B, that's brilliant, because if you didn't make it specific and put a line in the sand, then nothing would ever happen, especially when you look at, you know, and I'm not just saying FTSE Fortune type businesses that are, spending lots of money and time on, talking about diversity and inclusion, yet have zero representation at board or C-suite levels. So they tend to, from my personal experience, fall into one of two buckets. And I wondered what your take on that is.
I think it's a difficult one, because kind of we do have representation at those higher levels. So I think for us, it naturally filters down in terms of how people do that shortlisting, because we have that representation there. I think slightly what I would also say is, for us, it's kind of also understanding before we even get to the shortlist what we're doing. So for example, we're doing work around actually what our job descriptions look like, and do we have kind of gender coded words, or all that kind of stuff. We're just contemplating as to whether we should kind of run the job descriptions through any sort of kind of you can get the softwares and things like that to actually get some data around actually where we could be better in that area. I mean, to be honest, the bank loves the statistics, so anywhere we can get data, we'll try and do that. But yeah, I think it's a more broader picture than kind of the shortlist as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We've had someone who's made note of, I think they've been on your website here, talking about metrics. So good time for me to mention this is, and for those that want to perhaps have a look at this, maybe you could share with us for us to be able to point people in the right direction. But there's a mention in your website, according to one of our participants, that your UK VC and Female Founders Report, which is commissioned by Chancellor Philip Hammond, at 2017 budget and undertaken by British Business Bank, partnership with Diversity VC, and the BVCA identifies those very specific barriers which are faced by female-led firms in accessing venture capital. So that's very interesting, and perhaps we will, because someone has brought that up specifically, share some of those links in there, because you're right, it is about metrics. I know sometimes, when you talk too much about the metrics, we've been told it can switch people off, but at the end of the day, that is exactly how you prove a certain point. It's not just that nice to have, it comes out in the numbers specifically, because it's the age-old adage, what gets measured gets managed. And if we don't do that, it's really hard to prove and show that we've gone from here to here.
Yeah, and I definitely think that that's how we are going to, I mean, it's not obviously the be all and end all about the data, around the data, but I think definitely from kind of our organisation and how we work, then that's how we will help drive that conversation, because people can, it's tangible, and people can see what that is and what those statistics are. I mean, yeah, I'll be honest, it's kind of, even just doing the job descriptions, I know I'm going back to the same thing, but kind of just starting to look at that and having that conversation in the organisation has now started to help those hiring managers actually think about what they write and words. I mean, some of the words that kind of was in there, and when you say to them, do you realize that this puts people off, or kind of people will think twice about this, then actually they don't. And it's that awareness as well of kind of what you're putting in there.
Absolutely. And just another couple of questions here about, so thanks Amy, really insightful so far. We're very early on in our D&I journey as a company also, and I wondered, what have been the biggest challenges you've had so far? Big question. And how did you overcome these?
Oh, so I would say for us, it is slightly around when I talk to people around inclusion, lots of people want to be involved in the conversation, but actually I think it's finding a way. And I think that the employee resource group will help with this, but actually having that safe space for people to talk about their own experiences and kind of feel that they aren't going to say the wrong things or the wrong words or anything like that. So I think I've learned that actually yeah, we need to just make sure that people feel reassured that actually there is that there for them, and that, you know, that will help.
And we have a question as well around your ERG, and I was thinking the same thing myself, actually. But this individual says, you've mentioned that you recently launched your first ERG, which is excellent. Great step in the journey, fantastic. Lots of businesses starting to do employee resource groups, business resource groups, lots of different names for them, employee networks and what have you. Many organisations, this person says, would have more than one of these. How do you therefore plan to adapt your ERG to cover multiple facets of diversity and inclusion across one ERG instead of several different ones? And what was the kind of thinking and the rationale behind that?
So that's a really good question, because I'll be honest, it's something that we debated with kind of the network of people that I talked to around diversity and inclusion within the organisation. This was a debate that we had for quite a while. And a kind of our thought process around that is, because we're so early on in the journey and these conversations are only just started, that we didn't actually feel that we would get that traction or that leverage with lots of different groups, and we felt that we needed to start with one group so that we open up that conversation and people start to get used to having these resource groups that they can draw on, and that will be active within the organisation before we move on to anything else. I mean, going back to the foundation, it's about having that foundation there before we move on to other things. But how I see it, this is my personal view, how I see it kind of starting to form and shape is that as we start to move on the journey, that people will naturally perhaps take the lead on some of the areas, and then at some point we might start to think about if we split the group and just have one group and then subgroups. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's how it will go.
Mm-hmm. And we had quite a few other questions on the ERGs, actually. One person who is not in their company, they've not set one up yet at all, and they're just about to. Have you any advice on how you went about actually setting that up? Because I know you'd mentioned on mission statement, which is another question about how you went to form that from the employees. We'd love to hear a snippet if there was any of that, but how you actually went about forming and then communicating this group. Did you do a test analysis of a certain number of people? Did you send out a survey? How did you go about setting it up? And for this individual in specific, they've got nothing there at the moment, but it's getting talked about a lot, and there's a lot of pressure to set one/more up. So literally, how did you go from day dot to do that?
So we did. We set up a survey with our internal communications people, but kind of the best piece of advice that I can give out is that get somebody at the top or near the top to sponsor that, because what happened with us is that we have a meeting every couple of months, and it's the entire organisation. And what we got them to do is to speak about their journey, their experiences, and then to also to explain a bit about the ERG and kind of what we expect from it, what we'd like to get from it, and kind of just to give us a good old plug, to be honest. And then that was the best traction that we got within the organisation, because people thought, actually, this is from the top. People are, are bought into this at the top. So it gave us a good amount of traction to get people to come forward, to be honest. I mean, the other thing that I would say is that if you've got that network within the organisation, then I definitely used my network because there were people that have spoken to me for a long time about inclusion and what we can do within the organisation. So I definitely would say draw on that if you can. I know that not everybody will want to be involved and they don't actually want to come forward, but if you can, I would use that as well.
And how did you make decisions over the time commitment as well? Because you mentioned there, and this is also the case within lots of organisations, is diversity and inclusion and belonging is often bolted on as an addition to many people's role. Now, it's great that you're spending a lot of your role in specific focusing on this, but how did you then make decisions over some people being there as and when, and then some who you mentioned within the presentation who would be committed to a certain time? How often is required? Would you have made a decision on that level of the person before looking at the time requirement? how did that play out, and what was your decision-making process there?
So it is slightly a bit of an unknown, considering that we will only be meeting for the first time, in the next couple of weeks. So it is slightly a bit of an unknown, and it is slightly a work in progress. But we've kind of empowered our colleagues to make that decision themselves. I mean, what I would say is the top of our organisation are really bought into inclusion. So wherever we can, then there shouldn't be an issue with that. Shouldn't be a factor to hold people back. It should be, this is something that we want to drive forward in the organisation, so it shouldn't really be a factor to hold them back. But you're right, it is a balance.
It's really good news about the exec being brought in, and often this is the case. Occasionally it is not the case, and a few have asked questions about this. Now, obviously, you're in a great and lucky, fortunate situation that the exec are brought in, they're engaged, they're willing to speak out. I'm not saying where you are right now, but have you had instances where you've had to get someone engaged at senior level who hasn't otherwise been engaged? Are some of the emails that we had? And if so, how did you manage to turn those individuals around? Because we've got a number of, and again, it's something we've heard quite a lot, which is a little sad, is that D&I practitioners are lacking support, sometimes also budget and buy-in from exec, which makes it harder for them to disseminate the message and have it taken seriously. So in challenging circumstances like that, one, have you encountered it? And two, how would you advise going around getting them to be bought in as to why this is important?
I think it's definitely a difficult one because for me, and in my experience, it is that it's sometimes around awareness, and sometimes it's that lack of awareness and kind of not being informed. It is driving some of these conversations, and for me, it's about understanding that. I mean, as I said before, in terms of the data, that's been a great help for us because we can show things. But yeah, in terms of kind of people understanding kind of where they are, and you understanding what's driving those kind of decisions, and what you can do to help is the key thing for me, to be honest.
We had quite a few questions around Black Lives Matter and race and ethnicity, and it's interesting from our perspective. We've seen many businesses speak out and many businesses also not speak out. There was a couple of questions around what your decision-making rationale was around that. Now, we can appreciate with most businesses, this has been the real, I want to use the word game changer, but for many diversity and inclusion practitioners, they're utilising the Black Lives Matter movement to really put the foot on the gas and put the pressure on internally to actually make things happen. Questions around what you decided to do around this, and how you have how you've dealt with this internally and plan to ensure that it continues moving forward and isn't a distant memory from what happened in those particular months.
Yeah. So it is a difficult one, that question, because you're right. It did. So it's created that a real traction in the organisation, and lots of conversations. What we did as an organisation is we didn't speak out internally, but our CEO sent an email out to everybody around his thoughts around Black Lives Matter. It's a difficult one because at that point the ERG was not in place. We were in a different place, if I'm completely honest. So I probably think, could we have done more? Perhaps, yes. But kind of, I think sometimes you need to accept you are where you are with things, and use it for a better. So actually, on the back of that email, we definitely, the conversation started, we're definitely using it to do traction. So within a relatively short space of time, we've been able to set up the ERG, we've been able to get some real traction on our overarching strategy. So it's we've definitely been using that within the organisation to to move forward with those conversations and accelerate them.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that we had around this was whether there was, and obviously we're in a confidential space, was whether there was any backlash or any uncomfortable conversations that were had. We've had a number of those within our membership and within our network who've had some upsetting and difficult, uncomfortable conversations, accidents where people have been approached about discussing Black Lives Matter and haven't wanted to. And, you know, it did cause a little bit of a ripple of panic. And so just wondered whether you had, you know, any experiences of any backlash and how you overcame those. Because at the end of the day, as you say, it's about moving forward. It's obviously good to talk about the challenges we've all collectively had, and look, no organization and no human being is ever perfect. We can only ever try our best and try and move forward. But any thoughts on that?
So it's been slightly a mix, to be honest. Some people have really wanted to talk about it and been kind of key to moving forward. We've had quite a few teams where people have come forward and said, I want to talk about my experiences, so they've been able to facilitate a conversation within the team. We've had other people that have said, I don't want to talk about it. It's not something that I want to, you know, I don't want to draw on those experiences. I don't want to think about them. So they've been quite private with that, which is fine, obviously. But for me, it's been really around kind of us in the organisation understanding that and supporting that, and kind of being very aware that all people are different, and what is good for one person and what one person is comfortable with, another person isn't. So we have had some kind of mix. We have had mixed responses around it, and how people have taken things. But there has also been some really good conversations and happening within the organisation.
Brilliant. And just literally, sorry, I have actually got two last questions here. If anyone else has got any other questions, please put them in the chat or send them across to the team on LinkedIn or me on WhatsApp, and we'll get those answered for you because we are running out of time. So very quickly, do you feel it has made an impact either positively or negatively on your planning process, having had to do a significant amount of this during the COVID-19 pandemic?
It's definitely had an impact. Definitely what I would say, because we've been all working from home, and we will do for an extended period of time in the future, it's definitely impacted kind of on the culture of the organisation, but also how we've had conversations, and we've definitely had to think about how we do things virtually as opposed to in person, and what impact that has on people. But also just things like, you know, virtually it's harder to read a room virtually, and sometimes when you're having conversations that are kind of more personal, it's difficult to know what those people are actually feeling, because you can't read the body language and you can't see that. So we've really had to bear that in mind when we're having some of these conversations.
Thank you. And finally, because I know that we've actually used up pretty much all of the time today, but thank you all ever so much for your questions. Finally, this one is on, have you found certain people to be more engaged in the D&I initiatives, and how do you plan to try and increase engagement for the wider company? It's a very good question.
The answer is yes, definitely. Some people are more engaged around inclusion in the organisation than others, which is fine. I think for me, it's around small steps, and it's also around kind of having those first initial conversations with people, understanding kind of where their thoughts are with inclusion, and to understand kind of to start to understand their perspective on things. I mean, to be honest, you'll always get a set of people that aren't as engaged, because, you know, that's fine. Some people with any subject, some people are more engaged than others. But yeah, I think it's just around kind of understanding where they are, to be honest, so that we can kind of start to think around, if we understand and they also understand, then how we kind of include that in what we're doing.
Absolutely, and you can use these individuals or groups of people as well that are going to naturally be more engaged to speak out more, because there's people that love speaking out. There's people who, perhaps a little more, a little bit more shy or reserved or feel uncomfortable talking about personal stories. But ultimately, the more we find people share, the more it has that snowball effect and other people start to open up and the likelihood increases. The more people you have speaking, the more people you have engaging initially, whether it be those certain group of people who do it time and time again, it does eventually grow, because at some point in time, something that someone says ends up sparking something inside someone else that makes them feel they can relate to that, whether it be, race, religion, culture, mental health, a certain festival, talking about talent, whether they've had someone in their family or in their personal lives that might have suffered from, from a certain disability, or whatever it might be. So that's great. And by way of summary, because I am conscious just of timing here and we literally are just a minute or so, and I always do a very brief summary at the end. I think there's been some really great things here, especially on the foundation pieces and really setting out the stall and mapping it out. If you're tuning in and know we've got some familiar names and faces, I can see here Kamini, Jackie, and Dewey. So hi guys, and hope that you're all well. For those who have written in, especially who are at the beginning of their journey, very, very useful. And also looking at segregating these into different buckets has been excellent. I made a couple of notes here around the recruitment, the training, the events, really making sure that you're investing in these pieces. If there is not exec sponsorship within your organization, that is critical. If you're having issues getting that exec sponsorship yourself, gather a group perhaps of individuals to really try and engage at least someone from the exec, because that has been the biggest driver to actually making these things work. As you said, Amy, getting someone from Exco, having someone who's visible, having someone who's going to speak out is key. But then also the pieces around data. I mean, it's absolutely critical. HR policies, procedures. If you're in HR, obviously you'll know about all of that. But if you're not, then making sure that you do loop in to see where we can start tracking and measuring and managing this. Employee life cycle stuff as well. I thought that was excellent, and kind of really having those regular checkpoints. If you don't have those regular checkpoints, then you haven't kind of looked at the D&I calendar, looked at what you've got already. You end up building in lots and lots of different places. Now, eventually, that is something that becomes quite natural. We've seen lots of large organizations got cultures and diversities within diversities, ERGs within ERGs, but make sure you start somewhere. Everyone can make a difference, whether it be foundation level, whether it be kind of fast accelerated. Diversity and inclusion, belonging, something that we're constantly reviewing, repeating, tracking, measuring, something that will never ever be done. So making sure you got those goalposts in, as you've alluded to there, Amy, is excellent. So thank you very, very much indeed for your time today. Really appreciate it. Thank you everyone who's participated, who's sent in a number of questions, who's here today, and also thank you to those that have sent in a number of questions who are offline at the time of this recording but have written in advance. If you're watching on demand, thank you very much for tuning in. If you've missed anything, don't worry at all, or you want any of your employees or colleagues to rewatch this, we'll put all of the links, all the key learning points into the session after today. You'll be able to download the presentation, which Amy has very kindly shared, and you'll also be able to rewatch at any point if you visit www.dialglobal.org, and you can join our community there or reach out to the team for any other questions. We'll look forward to seeing you again at the same time next week. And once again, Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.